Good morning, and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. My name is Carolyn Houston. Last week we talked about what we're going to study this year. We're going to study something called a kingdom divided, and that kingdom is the nation Israel. And we also talked about our Bibles and the fact that we can use our Bibles to check things that we hear that people say about the Bible. Are they true or not? We can also use our Bibles to check things like, what if somebody says, I'm going to do this and I don't think it's wrong? Well, we can check the Bible and see what that says, because what God says is the most important thing. This week we are going to talk about God's plan and his promises, especially for the nation Israel. So, talking about promises, have you ever made a promise to someone and you didn't keep it? Or has somebody made you a promise and they didn't keep it? What about God? Does God keep his promises? Well, I've got a spin wheel, and I thought we could check on this spin wheel whether or not God keeps his promises. Is this a good way to check? It's not, is it? Where we need to check for something like that is, of course, the Bible. And you know that I did check, and this is what I found. I found in the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 19, this is what it says. God is not a man, so he does not lie or change his mind. Has he ever spoken and failed to act? Has he ever promised and not carried through? God always does what he says he's going to do. He always keeps his promises. Now, God made some very great promises to a man called Abraham. He chose Abraham. He said, I am going to make a great nation out of you. Now, we don't know too much about Abraham. We do know that he came from a city called Ur of the Chaldees. But that was a very ancient city, and it no longer exists. It's not on the map anymore. So this is a modern day map, and so you can see that this is Iraq and this is Iran. But this is where Ur would have been, and this is where Abraham came from. Now, Ur was a very famous city, a very wealthy city, and it was famous for worshiping idols. Yes, right in the middle of Ur, there was something called a ziggurat. And a ziggurat is a temple for idols, and this one was built for the sun and the moon gods. This is where Abraham lived. Now, the Bible tells us that Abraham's father worshipped idols. Now, we don't know if Abraham did, but we know that he didn't know who the one true God was. But God called Abraham. He chose him. And he said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. Now, I'm going to read to you exactly what God said to Abraham. I'm going to read it from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And in these verses, God says, I will, a number of times. So I want you to count how many times he says, I will. Are you ready? All right. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So how many times? Did you count 5? 5 times God said, I will, and he did, because God keeps all of his promises. He even told Abraham, go outside and look at the stars. Look at the stars in the sky and count them. Could you count those? I know I couldn't. He said to Abraham, I am going to make your descendants more numerous than all of the stars in the sky. Isn't that a great promise? That's amazing. Now, I wondered, I had a question. I thought, why did God choose Abraham? Why didn't he choose somebody else? When God called Abraham, he didn't even know who God was. So I thought I would check from here. Now, I checked the beginning of the Bible and I checked through the middle. I checked towards the end. I checked everywhere. And you know what I found? I found that God does not tell us why he chose Abraham. But while I was checking, I did find this verse. I found this verse in Psalm 115, verse 3. This is what it says. Our God is in heaven, and he does whatever pleases him. So that is why God chose Abraham. He wanted to. Yeah. Now, how do we know that Abraham believed what God promised him? Well, we know because Abraham did what God said. He got up and left Ur of the Chaldees. That's what God had told him to do. Get up and go to a place that I'm going to show you. And so Abraham did. He got up, he took his father, he took his wife Sarah, he took his nephew Lot, he took everything he owned, everything, and just left. He didn't even know where he was going. But he trusted God, and he trusted that God would show him. Do you want to know where he ended up? Eventually, from Ur, he traveled all the way up here, came around to here. This is the Dead Sea. This is part of Israel. So Abraham was going to end up here, but he didn't know that. He just left. God said, I'm going to show you. Now, when Abraham had a son, just after a long time, he had a son called Isaac. Because when God gave Abraham those promises, he didn't have any sons at all. But Isaac had a son as well, and his son was called Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. And those 12 sons make up the people of Israel, the nation Israel, all of the descendants. And so when they got established in the promised land, all of the sons of Jacob, we call them tribes, they all settled in places after their own tribe or sons. So like all the descendants, all the families of Asher were up here, and all the descendants of, who have we got down here? Reuben are here. We've got Judah. So everybody settled in their own place. Yeah. All right. Now, do you remember last week we talked about how all of the stories in the Bible, they all fit together into one big story. And you know, in Genesis, the very first book of the Old Testament, we have this story of Abraham. And already in this very first book of the Bible, it's all fitting into God's great big story, God's plan to send Jesus as a rescuer for our sin, because Jesus came from the nation of Israel. God had a plan for Israel. Israel was supposed to be an example to all the nations around them and to teach them of the one true God. But also from Israel would come Jesus. Now, Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. That was God's big plan, the big story, and it's already fitting together. Now, God made some wonderful promises to Abraham, and he kept all of them. But you know, the Bible is full of God's promises to us too, and he wants us to believe them. You know, the very best thing about Abraham was that he believed God's promises. You know, if we believe his promises, it makes such a difference to our lives. So I want to tell you about a promise that made a big difference to my life. You know, a few years ago, my husband said that he would help out a church in the town of Banff. Now, Banff is a beautiful little town. It's a tourist town. It's right in the mountains. But, you know, we don't live in Banff. We live about an hour and a half away from Banff. So we drove out there every Sunday morning, and then we came back every Sunday night. But, you know, when we drove back at night, it was very dark on the highway. And I began to worry that, you know, it's because it's through the mountains, and I thought maybe a deer or a moose might jump out of the ditch and hit our car. I began to worry about that. And, you know, I knew that it said in the Bible that we should not be worried or be anxious about anything, but I just couldn't help it. And so one day I just prayed, and I said, Dear Lord Jesus, please help me not to be worried or afraid of animals jumping out of the ditch at us. I don't know what to do. You need to help me. And about 2 days later, well, I was just reading my Bible. I was just reading where I had left off the day before. And this is what I read. Let me find it for you right here. It's in Exodus. Exodus chapter 23, verse 20. This is what it says. See, I am sending an angel before you to protect you on your journey and to lead you safely to the place that I have prepared for you. Well, that verse, that promise, it just jumped off the page at me. And I just believed it. I believed that every time we drove out to Banff and back, that God sent an angel to protect us, to guard us on the way. And you know what? He did. We drove out to Banff for almost 2 years, and never once did an animal jump out of the ditch and hit our car, because God keeps his promises. Being a Jesus follower is so exciting. It's just the best way to live, because when we believe what God's promises, we see him working in our lives. It's exciting. God's Bible, his word, is full of promises for you and for me. We just have to believe them. Yeah, he's a promise keeper. Last week we talked about also Israel, when it had been established, that God gave them a king of his own choosing, and his name was David. There was no king like him. Every king after David was compared to him. Now, next week, we are going to find out, we're going to talk about David's son, Solomon. Solomon became king after David died. And Solomon started off so well, but then he got into so much trouble. And that is why the kingdom divided. So come back next week and hear about Solomon. See you later.